A city in winter. Gray sky, empty streets. The kind of February morning that makes everything look smaller than it is. Pull back. An industrial block on the northeastern edge. Chain link fences, vacant lots. Buildings that stopped being used before anyone thought to write it down. Move closer. One garage, corner lot. 900 square feet of concrete and corrugated tin. Roll-up door frozen shut for 3 years. A hand-painted sign staked at the gate with a single phone number. Closer still, a man in a work jacket. Standing across the street. Not moving. Just looking at the building the way you look at something when you've already made the decision and you're waiting to see if the decision was right. He doesn't go in yet, he just sits in his car, in the cold, and waits. Inside that garage, under 8 blue tarps, sat a secret worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. Nobody knew, nobody looked, until he did. There is a garage on Kellner Street that nobody wanted. 900 square feet, concrete block walls, corrugated tin roof with a sag at the eastern corner that had been getting worse for years without anyone left to care. A roll-up door that hadn't moved in 3 years. The kind of building that exists in the background of every city. Not abandoned dramatically, not collapsed, just quietly given up on. Forgotten the way you forget something you never thought was worth remembering. The woman who sold it called it a pile of junk. She said this out loud, to the man buying it, while he was standing right there. He didn't argue, didn't flinch. Just took the key, slid it into the pocket of his work jacket, and walked out into the kind of February cold that makes every choice feel questionable. 6 months later, that man's name was on the front page of a regional business publication, and the woman who sold him the garage was standing outside a building that used to belong to her company, looking at a result she had set in motion herself and could not undo. Pay attention, because what happened inside that garage changes everything you think you know about where value hides, and what it costs a person to stop looking too soon. Cole Hargrove grew up in a house that smelled like motor oil and burnt coffee. Not sometimes, always. His father, Ray Hargrove, opened a one-bay garage on the outskirts of Detroit in 1987. Ran it for 22 years. Built it with his hands, kept it with his hands until his back gave out and his hands couldn't hold a wrench steady anymore. Until the thing he'd built had to be handed to time because time eventually wins. Ray Hargrove was not a wealthy man. Was not a celebrated man. Never had his name in any publication, never received any award, never built anything beyond what fit inside a single bay with room for 2 cars and a workbench along the back wall. What he built was something else. Something that doesn't have a category on a balance sheet. He taught his son how to see. Not with lectures, not with a curriculum, by letting Cole stand next to him and watch, every Saturday, no exceptions. Rain, snow, the holidays that other families spent watching television, while the Hargrove men were elbow-deep in an engine block that wouldn't cooperate. Cole remembered one Christmas morning. He was 9. When Ray had a transmission job that couldn't wait and Cole was in the garage by 8 o'clock, with a cup of hot chocolate going cold on the workbench, watching his father work, not complaining. Because this was just what Saturdays were. What every day off was. The garage smelled the same every morning. Damp concrete, cutting fluid, the faint char of something electrical that had been repaired badly once and carried the memory of it. Cole was 7 the first time Ray let him hold a flashlight during a transmission job. Not do anything, just hold the light steady. Point it where Ray pointed. Don't shake. Cole didn't shake. He was 11 when Ray started making him listen first. Before touching anything. Before saying anything. Just listen. Tell me what you hear. Cole would crouch next to the car with his ear toward the engine the way other kids pressed ears to seashells, and he would say, something in the top end. Or it's skipping on the cold start. Or that knock is lower than it sounds. Ray would nod once, then get to work. By 17, Cole could diagnose an engine fault by sound alone. By 19, he was rebuilding transmissions from scratch. By 22, he had graduated with an engineering degree in automotive systems, near the top of his class, and landed a position at Vantage Auto Holdings. A mid-size firm with a technical restoration division that required both academic precision and hands-on instinct. Cole had both, in abundance. Ray lived to see Cole's first year at Vantage. Died the following spring quietly, in the way that men who spent their lives working with their hands sometimes go, as though the body simply decided one morning that the work was done. He left Cole almost nothing in terms of money. The garage had been sold 2 years before to cover the medical bills. What he left was a notebook, worn at the corners. A water stain at the lower right edge from some year long ago when it had gotten wet and dried and never fully recovered. 30 years of observations inside. Measurements, repair notes, the things a man writes down at the end of a long day when the work has clarified something. Cole kept it in the inner pocket of his jacket from the day of the funeral. 7 years advantage. 7 years of being the person other people called when something looked too far gone to save. When the rust had gone deep and the specialist from the main office had already written the job off as a loss. Cole Hargrove. See what he says. Cole would go in, spend 20 minutes with the car, come back out and tell you exactly what it needed, what it would cost, and what it would be worth when the work was done. Not approximately, not roughly, exactly. He was not the loudest voice in any room. He was often the most accurate one. Which should have protected him. It didn't. The email arrived on a Friday night in June, 11:17 p.m. Cole was at the kitchen table of the apartment he rented, the one that barely held his tools and a bed, not doing anything in particular. Coffee gone cold, the week behind him. Just sitting in the quiet the way you sit when a long week finally lets go of you. His phone lit up. He opened it. Vantage Auto Holdings had finalized a corporate merger. The acquiring company had reviewed all operating divisions. The technical restoration division did not fit the new financial model, did not generate returns on the required timeline, did not, as the email phrased it with the bloodlessness of corporate language, align with strategic growth objectives. 14 people. One email. Friday 11:17 p.m. Cole read it twice, slowly. The way you read something when you want to be certain you've understood it before you let yourself respond to it. Then he set the phone down on the table, face up, screen still lit, sat in the dark for a while. Didn't reply, didn't call anyone, turned the screen off, went to sleep. The next morning he made a list, not a list of grievances, not a list of people to be angry at, a list of practical things, what he had, what he owed. What the next 60 days needed to look like if he was going to come out of this with his footing intact. That was the moment. Right there at the kitchen table with a pen and a yellow legal pad. The moment that explained everything that came after. 8 months of getting to work, nights at an impound yard, patching vehicles, running diagnostics for a flat hourly rate that was a fraction of what his skills were worth. He didn't complain about the rate. He showed up, did the work correctly, and put the money aside. Groceries on a budget. Rent covered. Nothing spent on anything that wasn't necessary. He didn't talk about Vantage. He didn't perform the grief of it, or the anger of it, or the injustice of it to anyone who would listen. Because performing it doesn't move you forward. It just keeps you in the same place, reviewing the same wreckage, while the clock runs. He had watched his father absorb hard years in the garage. Years when the work was slow and the bills were tight, without once making the family sit with the weight of it. Ray had just kept working. Had just kept showing up. Had passed that particular discipline to Cole the way he'd passed everything. Not by explaining it, by doing it in front of him until it became the only way Cole knew how to be. So he kept working. He looked, quietly, methodically, the way Ray had taught him to look at a broken engine, without expecting the right thing to announce itself. The right thing never announces itself. You have to find it. By the end of 8 months, he had $18,000 in savings. Not enough to open a shop, but enough to start something, if the right start showed up. Now, before we go further, we need to talk about Sandra Whitfield. Because this story has 2 people in it, and you need to understand both of them before you can understand what happened between them. Sandra Whitfield was 38 years old, and she ran Whitfield Capital Group, a real estate firm her father had built from scratch and handed to her at 29 when his heart gave out faster than any of them expected. She took what her father left her and doubled its revenue in 10 years. Not by luck, not by accident. By being very, very good at seeing things before other people saw them. The model was clean. Find industrial land nobody wants. Land that looks like nothing. Former manufacturing zones, dormant parcels sitting on tax rolls for a decade because they're too unpromising for anyone to bother with. Buy at prices reflecting how they look right now. Get the zoning changed. Sell to developers at prices reflecting what they could become. The gap between those 2 prices. That was Sandra's business. She had been called a visionary by the local Chamber of Commerce. She had been called a bulldozer by every person who had ever sat across a table from her in a negotiation. Both descriptions were accurate. Both missed something. Sandra wasn't unkind the way people who enjoy cruelty are unkind. She was something different. She was indifferent to anything she didn't understand immediately, to anything that didn't fit her framework inside the first 30 seconds of looking at it. Indifference is harder to argue with than malice. Malice at least has to acknowledge what it's looking at. Indifference doesn't register the evidence in the first place. Her father used to say, "Value is in the land, not in whatever's standing on it." She grew up with that sentence. She built a business on it. She had never once needed to question it. She was about to. In January of that year, Whitfield Capital acquired a 4-acre parcel of old industrial land on the northeastern edge of the city, dormant for over a decade, former light manufacturing zone. The plan was clean: hold the land, push through a rezoning application for mixed commercial use, flip the parcel to a larger development group within 2 years. Standard operation. They had done it a dozen times. The complication was a garage, sitting at the rear corner of the property. 900 square feet. Built sometime in the 1960s with a corrugated tin roof, 3 collapsed shelving units along the interior walls, a roll-up door that hadn't operated in 3 years, 2 of the 4 side windows boarded over with plywood pulling apart at the corners, and an electrical system that Sandra's contracted engineer described, in his site report, in a single word: dead. He went inside, looked around, came back out, wrote his assessment. Demolition target. Estimated clearance cost, $12,000 to $15,000. Sandra looked at that number for 4 seconds. Then she told Patrick Sorensen, her assistant, to list the structure for sale and move on. She was not spending $15,000 to clear a building, she called. Directly, without softening, a pile of junk not worth the cost of clearing. A hand-painted sign went up at the gate. Sandra moved to the next item on her agenda. Danny Kowalski heard about the garage from a truck driver. This is how things move in the trades. Not through listings, not through announcements, through conversations in parking lots and diner booths, and the cab of a flatbed, while hauling scrap from a neighborhood that used to be something, and might be on its way to becoming something again. Danny was freelancing, welding, fabrication, engine work, whatever came through. He'd worked alongside Cole at Vantage for 3 years before the layoffs, and the two of them had stayed close the way men in the trades stay close. Not by talking about it. Just by showing up when the other one needed an extra set of hands. He called Cole on a Tuesday evening in late January. More instinct than certainty. Old garage, he said, bad condition. Whitfield Capital wants it gone cheap. Cole said very little on the phone. Which Danny had learned over years of knowing him meant something. Cole said very little about everything. But this silence had a different texture. This one had weight to it. Cole said he'd take a look in the morning. Danny said, sure. The temperature was 19 degrees when Cole parked across the street from 414 Kellner Street at 17:45 the following morning. Light snow, moving sideways in the wind, the kind of cold that doesn't just settle on you. It finds the gaps. In every open seam, every place where your collar doesn't quite meet your jacket. Cole sat in the car, did not get out. Looked at the building through the windshield for 15 minutes without moving. He was not looking at the corrugated tin, not looking at the warped door frame, or the boarded windows or the sag in the eastern roofline. Those things were visible. He'd already registered them. He was looking at the address. He knew this intersection. He'd driven through it dozens of times over the years. He knew the secondary roads that fed into it. He knew the highway on-ramp sitting a quarter mile to the north. And he knew about the bus corridor, not from any official announcement, just from a conversation with Ted Calloway, an old friend from his university years, now working in municipal planning. A lunch 8 months back. Ted had mentioned the corridor the way planners mention things they consider obvious. Phase 2 development zone, infrastructure expansion. 12 to 18 months out, Ted hadn't been selling anything, just talking. Cole had filed it away the way he filed everything, precisely, without deciding yet what to do with it. Sitting in the car now, he looked at the building, looked at the corner, looked at the vacant lots across the secondary road, looked at the gap in the chain link where the gate sat propped. Then he called the number on the sign. Got Patrick Sorensen, arranged a viewing for the following week, put the car in drive and pulled away. The decision had already been made. He just hadn't seen the inside yet. The appointment was set for Thursday morning. 10 o'clock, Sandra arrived at 10:02. Which, for Sandra, was late. A call had run long, which meant she was already in the particular efficiency-seeking state that made her assessments faster and less patient than usual. She brought Patrick, a contracted structural engineer, and the real estate attorney. She wore a caramel-colored wool coat and heeled boots on ground that did not deserve either. She carried the expression of someone who has already decided that a meeting is a formality before she has gotten out of the car. Cole arrived at 9:58, work jacket, spiral notebook. A pen clipped to the front cover. His hands clean in the way that takes effort when your work follows you home but still leaves traces of what you do for a living. He stood at the gate. When Sandra stepped out of her car, she looked at the property for about 4 seconds, a sweep, not an examination, and then looked at Cole. 3 seconds, top to bottom. Then she asked him, in a tone calibrated to be overheard by Patrick, whether he was a mechanic or a scrap hauler. Not because she needed the answer, because the answer confirmed what she'd already decided. Cole looked at her, didn't answer. Asked if he could see the inside. Sandra unlocked the side entrance. The roll-up hadn't moved in 3 years and wasn't going to move today, and gestured for him to go ahead, then followed with her group. Inside, dark, cold in the way buildings hold cold. Not wind cold, settled cold, the kind that lives in the walls and doesn't move because nothing has moved it in a long time. Cole turned on his flashlight. Sandra began immediately, the way a real estate agent lists features, but in reverse. The roll-up door jammed for 3 years. 3 visible structural cracks in the ceiling joists. Electrical system, non-functional, full replacement required. Possible foundation settling in the northwest quadrant, flagged in the site assessment. She said clearly that her team had valued the property, accounting for demolition costs, at negative $15,000. Not zero, negative. She made sure he understood. This was not a bargain being offered. This was a problem with a price on it, designed to make the problem disappear faster. Cole nodded and walked into the interior. He moved differently in here than he had outside. Methodical, wall to wall, corner to corner. One hand trailing along the concrete block, feeling for moisture, for structural shift, for anything the light couldn't tell him. He crouched to check the floor surface, looked up at the ceiling joists and stayed on each one long enough to actually learn something from it. He spent 12 minutes inside. Sandra checked her phone twice. Then Cole came back out into the cold and asked one question. How much? Sandra looked at him, turned to Patrick, repeated the question in a voice pitched for the group, as though the question itself was the punchline to a joke everyone in the room already knew. $1,000, she said, full liability waiver. A relocation clause requiring Cole to vacate within 18 months if the broader development project received formal approval and broke ground. Cole agreed, without negotiating, without pausing. The contract was signed at a folding table near the gate, wind cutting across the lot, the attorney watching over his shoulder. Cole's handwriting was even, his signature exactly what it always was, legible, unhurried. When it was done and the key was in his jacket pocket, Sandra said to Patrick, just loud enough, that she was noting in the file, the sale of a derelict garage to a very optimistic man. Quiet laughter. The group walked back to their vehicles. Cole stood at the gate, then turned back and walked the exterior one more time. Stopped near the side door. 2 seconds. He looked through the gap in the warped doorframe into the far interior corner. In the back of the space, under a large blue tarp that rose from the concrete floor nearly to the ceiling, something. He stood there for 2 seconds, didn't change expression, didn't say a word, walked to his car, drove away. He had seen it the first time he walked through. That's why he didn't negotiate. He came back at 6 the next morning, alone, heavy flashlight, pry bar, a full set of hand tools. The spiral notebook. He did not start with the walls or the ceiling or any of the structural problems Sandra had catalogued. He started with the tarps, 8 of them, varying sizes, tied with rope in some places, baling wire in others. Coated in years of dust and the gray residue of a space that had been sealed and left to settle. But placed with care, not thrown, not draped, arranged. Someone had taken time with this. Someone had meant for what was underneath to be protected. Cole pulled the first tarp back slowly. The way you open something you believe is valuable, but can't afford to be wrong about. Underneath, a car. He pulled the second tarp. Another car. He worked through all 8 in just under 30 minutes, careful with each one, re-securing edges as he went. 8 automobiles in 2 rough rows, arranged in the back 2/3 of the space, covered and left and forgotten in a building that an entire professional team had walked through, assessed and dismissed. Not one of them had touched a tarp. Not one. Cole stood in the middle of those 8 cars with his flashlight moving from one to the next, slow and steady, and said nothing out loud. Because there was nothing to say yet. He needed to know what he had first. The first car. He cleared enough dust with his sleeve to read the badge. 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback. Surface rust on the quarters and roof. Not deep, not structural. The kind that lives on the outside of metal that's still sound underneath. Paint peeling in wide strips. But the chrome trim was present, all of it, glass intact. When he opened the driver's door, it swung on hinges that had kept their integrity, and crouched to read the odometer. The number confirmed what the dust and the condition the sealed space had already suggested. This car had not moved in decades. He checked the VIN plate, original stampings, opened the hood, V8 block fully present, no catastrophic visible damage, cylinder head covers intact, carburetor seated where it belonged. He wrote 4 numbers in the notebook, closed the hood gently. The second car, a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro Z28. A production variant limited enough that serious collectors tracked examples the way historians track primary documents. Frame number readable, Rally Sport trim intact. He drew a small circle around that number in the notebook, just a small one. Upright notation. Cars 3 through 5, a 1958 Chevrolet Bel Air, a 1961 Ford Galaxy, a 1963 Buick Riviera. All recoverable. All worth real money after proper work, not at the level of the first 2, but real money. The kind that shows up in auction results and makes people who don't know cars stop and look twice. He wrote everything down. Then he reached the 6th car. He had to crouch, tilt his head, position the flashlight at a specific angle to read the badge without the glare coming back at him. He read it, read it again. De Tommaso Pantera, 1971. An Italian-American sports car, mid-engine layout, wedge profile, produced in limited numbers across its entire production run, total units, roughly 10,000. Finding one in any condition was unusual. They were uncommon by nature, by design, by the economics of what they were. Finding one in a forgotten garage in the northeastern United States, chassis intact, engine compartment sealed. Cole sat down on an overturned milk crate. His hands were steady. He was the kind of person whose hands stayed steady. But when he uncapped his pen and opened to a clean page, he wrote the frame number 3 times before he was satisfied he'd gotten it right. He sat with it for a moment, just sat. The last 2 cars were too far gone. Floor pans collapsed, body panels corroded past the point of return. But they held components. Carburetors, trim, original hardware. Components had value. Everything had value if you knew what to look for and what to do with what you found. He wrote it all down. Then he did the rough math on the back page of the notebook. Conservative estimates. He cut every number by 1/3 before he wrote it. Because rough estimates are the ones that bite you. Even cut by 1/3. Somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 in restored market value, if the work was done correctly. He had paid $1,000 for the building, and everything inside it. He walked the surrounding blocks that afternoon. The cold had eased slightly. Still February, still gray, but the kind of cold that lets you keep your hands out of your pockets for a full minute. He knew this neighborhood the way you know a place from years of passing through, not from maps. From the quality of the light in winter. From the way traffic moved at certain hours. The vacant lots immediately behind the garage faced the secondary road. Their prices reflected what they looked like. Abandoned, unlandscaped, ringed with chain link. Nobody had connected them to anything yet. That evening he called Ted Calloway. Asked one neutral question. What was the development zone classification for that block? Ted gave one neutral answer. The entire area sat inside what the city's internal planning documents called a Phase 2 Commercial Development Priority Zone. Infrastructure upgrades would be formally announced within 12 to 18 months. Land values in the zone would shift accordingly. Cole thanked him. Ended the call, looked at the numbers in the notebook, and for the first time since 11/17 on that Friday night in June, he smiled. Not the wide-open smile of someone who can't believe their luck. the quiet, settled smile of someone who looked carefully and found what they were looking for. He called Danny the next morning at 7:15, didn't explain everything on the phone, and said, "I found something. No salary right away. I believe it will be worth the time." Danny asked how much Cole had paid for the property. Cole said $1,000. Pause, Danny said, "Say that again." Cole said $1,000, longer pause. Then Danny said, "I'll be there by 8. When Danny walked into the garage and saw the 8 cars partially uncovered, he stood still for a long time. He looked at the Camaro, then the Mustang. Then he found the Pantera on his own, without Cole pointing, without any direction, and he stood in front of it with his hands in his jacket pockets and didn't touch it, and just looked. Then he turned to Cole and said quietly that he needed to sit down. Cole told him they would start with the Mustang. Danny took off his jacket, hung it on a nail someone had driven into the wall sometime in the 1970s. Asked where the tools were, and they got to work. The first morning Danny showed up, they didn't talk much. That was normal. That had always been normal between them. 3 years working side by side at Vantage had established a rhythm that didn't require conversation to function. Cole assessed, Danny fabricated. Cole identified what was wrong. Danny built what was needed to fix it. The words, when they came, were specific, purposeful. Neither man spent language on things that didn't need to be said. What needed to be said that first week was very little. They had 8 cars, 2 sets of hands, and a building that needed to become a working shop before it could become anything else. Cole had planned the sequence before Danny arrived. Not written it down, he didn't need to write it down. He'd worked it out the morning after the tarps, sitting on the milk crate in the dark with the flashlight still in his hand, running the logic of it. Which car first? Which jobs could run parallel? Where the dependencies were? What had to happen before anything else could happen? The Mustang first. Most complete, most accessible, best chance of generating cash flow before the money ran out. But first, the shop itself. The electrical was dead. Sandra's engineer had been right about that much. The panel was not salvageable, and neither were the branch circuits running from it. Cole had budgeted for a full rewire. He pulled the permit himself, did the rough-in over 3 days, and had a licensed electrician friend come in to finish and sign off. Cost him $900 and called in a favor he'd been holding for 2 years. Worth it. Lighting came next. Proper work lighting. Not what the building had, which was nothing but what a shop needs. 4 overhead fixtures running the length of the main bay. 2 task lights on adjustable arms for close work. A dedicated circuit for the welder Danny brought in from his own shop. The roll-up door was simpler than it looked. The motor was dead, but the track was straight. Cole pulled the old motor, sourced a replacement through a salvage supplier he'd used at Vantage, installed it over a Saturday afternoon. When he tested it Sunday morning, the door ran clean, smooth. First time in 3 years. Danny stood watching. 3 years, he said. New motor, 3 years that door didn't open and nobody wondered what was behind it. Cole looked at the door running on its track. They saw a door that didn't open, he said. They stopped there. Danny thought about that for a moment. Then he went to get his tools. By the end of the first week, the shop was functional. Not finished, there were 100 things still wrong with the building, but functional. Lights on, power running, door opening, a space heater positioned at the center of the main bay, keeping a workable radius around the cars they were actively touching. Beyond that radius, February did what February does. Your breath made small clouds. Your fingers stiffened inside your gloves, and you had to stop every 40 minutes to wrap your hands around a coffee cup until the feeling came back. The cold lived in the floor, radiated up through your boots, and settled in your lower back around the 3rd hour of a long day. Danny complained about it exactly once. Cole said they couldn't run more heat without overloading the panel they'd just replaced. Danny said, "Right." And that was the end of the conversation about temperature for the entire duration of the project. The Mustang came apart over the first 2 weeks. Not dramatically, not all at once, systematically. Panel by panel, system by system, Cole working from the outside in, documenting everything before he moved it. Every fastener catalogued, every component photographed in position before removal. The notebook filling up with part numbers, condition notes, sourcing options. The body was better than it looked from across a dark garage. The surface rust on the quarters and roof hadn't penetrated. The floor pans were solid, not perfect, but solid. The frame was straight. These were the things that mattered most, and they had held. What hadn't held, the crankshaft was worn past the point of rebuilding, not salvageable, needed replacing. The carburetor was seized, not just dirty, seized, from sitting dry for too long. The cooling system hoses had gone to dust. The wiring harness was too brittle to trust. Every connector Cole touched threatened to crumble in his hand. He wrote it all down. Parts needed. Costs, timeline. The crankshaft was the problem. The right part, correct specification, correct origin, came from a private supplier in Ohio that Cole had used twice. Advantage. Reliable. But the lead time was 3 weeks, non-negotiable. 3 weeks meant a pivot, so they pivoted. Cole moved to the Bel Air while the crankshaft was in transit. Danny started pulling the Camaro down for inspection. Not restoration, just full disassembly and documentation, so they'd know exactly what they were working with when the time came. This is how projects actually work. Not the way you planned them. The way the materials and the money and the reality decide to arrange themselves around you while you adjust. The money was the part that wasn't adjusting well. $18,000 had seemed like enough to fund the Mustang through to a sale and generate cash flow for the rest of the sequence. That was the plan. The plan made sense on paper at the kitchen table the morning after the tarps. But parts cost what they cost. Sheet metal stock for Danny's fabrication work went faster than Cole had estimated, because Danny was thorough, and thorough was the whole point. The new wiring harness for the Mustang, old one too brittle to save, was $400 alone. Specialty fluids, jot compounds. The welder rod Danny burned through at a rate that would have seemed unreasonable to anyone who hadn't watched Danny work. $18,000 became $12,000 by the end of the second week. $12,000 became $8,000 by the end of the third. Cole checked the account on a Tuesday night when Danny had gone home and the grudge was quiet. The number was smaller than he'd expected it to be. He sat with it for a while, did not tell Danny. Because telling Danny required saying the number out loud, and saying it out loud made it more real than it needed to be right now. What they needed right now was to finish the Mustang. The number in the account was a fact. It was not a reason to stop. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to work. The money hit $4,200 on a Tuesday. Cole checked it alone, late at night. Danny had gone home. The space heater clicked through its cycle. The overhead work light threw hard shadows across the Mustang's engine bay. He ran the math without writing it down. He didn't need to write it down. Parts already ordered, not yet arrived, $800. Parts still needed to complete the Mustang, another $600 minimum. The wiring inspection on the Galaxy he'd committed to finishing before he moved on. $4,200 minus $100 in committed costs, $2,800 left. He sat on the milk crate for a while, not panicking. Panic uses energy that needs to go somewhere useful. He just sat with the number and looked at the Mustang, and looked at the Camaro, half disassembled, engine on the stand, and looked at the Pantera under its tarp in the corner where it had been waiting since February. Then he picked up his phone and called a contact at the impound yard. Asked if they needed anyone for night towing work this week. The contact said, yeah, actually this week and next. Cole said, I'm available. He came back from the first night at 2:47 in the morning. And slept 3 hours on the cot. Back at the workbench by 6, did this 4 nights over the next 2 weeks. Danny never knew about the towing. Or he knew, because Danny was not a man who missed things happening around him, and understood that this was not information being hidden from him. It was weight being carried in a specific direction, away from Danny, so Danny could keep his full attention on the work. Some things you don't explain when you're trying to build something. Not because you're hiding them, because explaining them takes energy you don't have to spare. Because the person across from you is already giving everything they have, and adding the weight of your worry to theirs doesn't help either of you get the next thing done. Cole had learned this from his father. Ray had never told the family when money was tight in the early years of the garage. Not out of pride, out of practicality. The information wouldn't have helped them. What he needed from them was to trust the work and keep showing up. He couldn't ask for that if every morning started with a balance sheet. So Cole kept the numbers to himself. And Danny, who had been watching Cole's face every morning for 6 weeks, kept his own counsel. Because some things you know without being told. And some things you don't bring up, because the other person is already carrying what they can carry, and saying it out loud would only make it heavier. They had a car to finish. That was what mattered right now. That was the only thing that mattered right now. The rain started around midnight on a Wednesday. Cole was alone. Danny had left at 10, which was late for Danny, who had a 40-minute drive home and a wife who had been remarkably patient about all of this. Cole was doing a wiring inspection on the Galaxy, the flashlight held between his chin and his chest, both hands occupied with the connector he was trying to read. He heard it before he saw it. Not the rain itself. He'd been listening to rain on the tin roof for an hour. Something under it. A higher note, a frequency that didn't belong. He looked up. The eastern corner of the roof was moving. Not dramatically. The kind of movement that happens when something has been stressed past its limit and is in the process of deciding, slowly, almost thoughtfully, whether to hold or let go. Cole set down the flashlight, stood up, watched the corner for 4 seconds, and then, with a sound less like a crash and more like a long exhale, the sound of something that has been holding on too long and finally just can't anymore. A section of the eastern roof panel separated from the joist and dropped. Not the whole roof, just enough. A column of cold February rain poured through the gap, directly onto the Camaro's engine bay, which was at that precise moment fully disassembled for inspection. Engine, on the stand, everything opened up. Every machine's surface, every cavity, every component they had spent 3 weeks carefully pulling apart and cataloging, exposed. Cole stood there. The rain fell into the open engine bay and spread the way water always spreads, finding every channel, every gap, pooling in the cylinder cavities, running along the block surfaces, getting into places that water should never be allowed to reach. He stood there for 10 full seconds, which was, given what he was looking at, a long time to stand still. Then he went to the back of the garage and found 2 additional tarps, brought them back and covered the Camaro, the engine on the stand, the disassembled components on the bench, everything exposed. Found rags. Started cleaning the water from what had already been reached, cylinder by cylinder, surface by surface, calm. Not because he wasn't feeling what you'd expect him to feel, but because panic is energy, and right now that energy had to go somewhere useful. He cleaned up the water. Then he picked up the flashlight and went back to the wiring inspection on the Galaxy. Danny arrived the next morning at 7:58, and the tops on the Camaro, and the gap in the roof visible in daylight, and the ring of dried water on the floor. He set down his coffee, looked at the roof, looked at the Camaro. The east corner, last night, came down around midnight. Danny walked to the Camaro, lifted the edge of one top and looked at the engine bay, at the engine on the stand, at the components lined up on the workbench. He put the tarp back down carefully. How bad? Manageable. I got to it quickly. Danny stood there for a moment with his hand still resting on the tarp. Then he looked at Cole. And Cole looked back. Neither of them said anything about what it would have meant if Cole hadn't been sleeping on the cot. If he'd gone home that night. If the rain had fallen into that open engine bay for 6 hours without anyone there to cover it. Neither of them said it. But they both knew. Danny picked up his tools, got to work. That night late, after Danny had gone home, Cole sat on the milk crate. The gap in the roof had been covered with plastic sheeting and duct tape. Temporary, imperfect, but it would hold for now. The Camaro was recovered. Cole had spent 4 hours that afternoon finishing the cleanup, assessing the water damage, confirming, carefully, thoroughly, that everything critical was intact. Manageable. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Not the spiral notebook with the vehicle records, the other one. Older. Worn at the corners, a water stain at the lower right edge from years back dried into the cover, permanent. Ray Hargrove's notebook. Cole held it for a moment without opening it, just the weight of it in his hands. There's a specific weight to something that belonged to someone who is gone. Heavier than the object itself. Always. He opened it to a page near the middle. He knew exactly where it was. He'd read every page in this notebook more times than he could count. Ray's handwriting. Blunt. Slanting slightly right. The handwriting of a man who was always in the middle of something when he wrote things down and didn't have patience for anything decorative. One sentence. When they see rust, you see the metal underneath. Cole sat with that. He'd read it as a child and thought it was a mechanic's saying. something old men put on workshop signs. He'd read it at 22 when he started at Vantage and understood it as a professional philosophy. He'd read it the night of the email at 11:17 and felt its weight differently, the weight of a man handing his son a way of surviving things. And now he was sitting in a cold garage with a failed roof and a water-damaged engine bay, and less money in the account than he wanted to think about, and a Pantera in the corner that nobody in the world knew was there, except the two men sleeping and working in this building. He took out his pen, uncapped it, and wrote, in his own hand directly below his father's words, $1,000 February. This is where it starts. He looked at it, both lines together on the page, his father's and his. Then he capped the pen, closed the notebook, tucked it back into the inner pocket of his jacket where it had lived since the day of the funeral, lay down on the cot, pulled the sleeping bag up, listened to the February wind against the patched roof, and slept. The crankshaft arrived from Ohio on a Thursday morning in the third week of February. Cole was at the garage at 5:30, waiting for the delivery truck. When it came, when he lifted the box and felt the weight and set it on the workbench and opened it and confirmed what was inside, he allowed himself 4 seconds of something that wasn't relief exactly and wasn't satisfaction exactly, but lived in the space between the two. Then he got to work. Installation took 2 full days. Not because it was a complicated job, but because Cole did not do things quickly. He did things correctly. These are different things and people confuse them constantly. He checked every measurement twice, torqued every fastener to specification, cleaned every mating surface before letting anything touch it, rebuilt the carburetor while the engine was apart, because you don't install a fresh crankshaft and leave a decades-old carburetor to fail on you in 3 weeks. Danny ran the body work in parallel, stripping the Mustang's exterior down to bare metal on the panels that needed it, finding the rust, treating what could be treated, cutting out what couldn't be saved and fabricating replacements from the sheet metal stock, clean seams, correct gauge, tight fits. He worked the way Cole worked, not fast, not slow, right. The paint process alone took a week and a half. Not because Danny was slow, because correct preparation takes the time it takes, and anything less shows up later in ways that can't be fixed without starting over. He stripped, primed twice, blocked, sprayed color in 2 coats, cleared in 2 coats, then cut and polished until the surface sat at a depth that didn't announce itself. Highland green, the factory correct shade, not close to correct, correct. The interior came next, re-trimmed in the right black vinyl, sourced through a specialist in North Carolina who still stocked period-correct material. Not approximate. Right. Because the buyers Cole was going to approach would know the difference, and the difference was the whole point. The chrome was handled piece by piece. Some components were pitted past saving. Those went out for re-chroming. Some were sound, just dirty. Those were cleaned and preserved. Not replaced wholesale. Preserved where possible, because original chrome carries a quality that new chrome can't replicate, and you don't replace what you can save just because saving it is harder. The engine, rebuilt to original specification. Every clearance measured, every seal replaced, every system tested before the hood closed. On a Saturday morning in late March, with thin spring light just clearing the rooftops across the street, Danny climbed behind the wheel. He turned the key. The engine didn't catch the first time. He looked at Cole through the windshield. Cole looked at the ceiling for 1 second. Danny turned the key again. The engine caught on the second crank, settled into an idle, deep even, the kind that doesn't ask for attention. That sits there and is, undeniably, exactly what it should be. Danny sat behind the wheel, didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached down and revved the engine once. Gently. The exhaust note moved through the morning air and did something to the quality of the air that doesn't have a useful practical word attached to it. But you know it when you hear it. Something in you recognizes it before your brain has time to explain why. Cole stood in the open roll-up doorway, arms crossed, listening. A full minute, then he said, "Good," walked back inside. He posted the listing that afternoon on a private forum, not a public marketplace where price gets driven by whoever shows up. A community of people who already knew what they were looking at, who asked the right questions and didn't need the car explained to them. 11 inquiries arrived in 72 hours. Cole read every one, answered the ones that came from genuine knowledge. Left the others, the ones asking about horsepower modifications, about making it louder or more visible. Those were not the right buyers for this car, and putting this car with the wrong buyer would be its own kind of failure. The inquiry he prioritized came from Eleanor Prescott, 55 years old, a widow living in Vermont. Over the past decade, she had assembled one of the more serious private collections of American classic automobiles in the northeastern region, housed in a climate-controlled facility on her property outside Montpelier. The collection had been her late husband's passion and had become, after his death, genuinely her own. She did not open with an offer. She opened with questions about the VIN, about the original build documentation, about the chrome restoration process and which suppliers had been used, about the carburetor rebuild specification, about whether the engine had been bored or kept to original dimensions. Cole answered each question with the same precision she brought to asking it. Not more, not less, no enthusiasm, no reassurance, just here is the fact. Make your own judgment. Eleanor responded within 2 hours of every reply. She arranged to come in person. She arrived on a Thursday morning in early April, drove herself, a sensible, well-maintained car. She stepped out, looked at the garage, at what it had become in 2 months, and said nothing about what it must have looked like before. Just walked in and looked at the Mustang the way someone looks at something they've been forming a judgment about from a distance, and are now ready to confirm. She had brought George Aldrich. George was a retired engineer, late 60s, flat cap worn soft from years of use, the steadiness of a man who spent 4 decades noticing things others missed and never needed anyone to validate his findings while he worked. He carried a reference notebook and a borescope in a worn case, and said about 11 words during the 2 hours he spent with the Mustang. The 11 words came in small, precise clusters, mostly, and hold this, and once quietly to the underside of the car, He spent a long stretch of time on his back on a rolling creeper, working the borescope into positions the car was never designed to make easy. When he was done, he stood up, rolled the creeper to the wall, capped the borescope, walked to Eleanor, said in a voice he kept low, "As correct as I've seen." Outside a museum, that was all. Eleanor thanked him. He nodded, went to stand near the wall with his hands in his pockets and waited. Eleanor turned to Cole. $94,000, she said. Not a question, not an opening bid with room to negotiate. A number she had already arrived at before she came through the door, formed from reading his documentation and his answers and understanding what she was going to find here. Cole said, yes. They shook hands. The wire transfer cleared 3 days later. Cole was at the workbench when the notification came through. Danny was across the garage, adjusting a fitting on the Bel Air, and looked over because Cole had gone still for a half-second longer than usual. "What?" Danny said. Cole turned the phone around. Danny walked across the garage, read the screen, stood there. Then grabbed Cole by both shoulders and shook him once, with the full, uncontrolled enthusiasm of a man who has been holding something compressed inside him for months and has just been formally handed permission to let it go. Cole allowed this for 2 seconds, took a step back, nodded once, went back to work. Before Eleanor left, she stopped near her car, pulled on her driving gloves, good leather, the kind that ages well when you treat them right. She looked at Cole. "If you come across anything worth your time," she said, "call me before you post it anywhere." Cole told her he appreciated that. Meant it. He did not say, "There are 6 more vehicles in the building behind you. 2 of them are exactly what you came here looking for today. One of them would make George Aldrich put down his borescope and stand very still." He didn't say any of it. Eleanor's car pulled out of the lot. Cole went back inside, opened the notebook to a clean page, and started planning the next step. The Pantera had been waiting in the corner since February. It could wait a few more weeks, but the planning started now. The money from Eleanor cleared on a Monday. By Wednesday, Cole had made 3 phone calls. First call, Frank Delano, body and paint specialist. 12 years at a restoration house in Pennsylvania before the house closed, and Frank found himself available at exactly the wrong time for him and the right time for Cole. His reputation moved through the trade the way real reputations move, not through advertising, through results. People who had seen his work mentioned it quietly to other people who needed that kind of work done. Cole had been hearing about Frank for years without a reason to call. Now he had a reason. Frank picked up on the second ring. Listen to what Cole described. Asked 2 questions about the Pantera. Specific questions. The kind that told Cole immediately that Frank already knew what a Pantera was and what working on one would require. Then he said, "When do you need me?" Cole said, "Monday." Frank said, "I'll be there at 8. Second call, Roy Sims. 15 years tracking rare components through private networks across the country. Not a dealer, a finder. There was a difference that mattered enormously in the world Cole was working in. Dealers bought inventory and sold at a markup. Roy found things that weren't in any catalog, that weren't listed anywhere, that existed somewhere in the country in someone's barn or storage unit or estate sale that hadn't been properly assessed yet. He knew people. He knew what people had. He knew who to call in which state for which part. Roy listened, took notes, said he'd start making calls. Third call, "Danny, I need you here officially." Pause, "I'm already here." Officially. The business is registering this week. I want your name attached to it in a way that reflects what you're actually doing. Longer pause. What does officially mean practically? Technical director. We'll sort out equity when there's more to sort out. The longest pause yet, then. I'll be 8. You're already here. I know, I'm making a point. The business registration went through on a Thursday. Hargrove Auto Works. Cole filled out the form at his desk, the small second-hand desk he'd set up in the corner of the main bay, and said the name out loud once, quietly, to the empty room before he filed the paperwork. It sounded like something that had always been going to exist, that had just taken this long to arrive. He filed the form. Poured a coffee. Went back to work. The land moves happened the same week. Cole had been watching the 3 vacant lots behind the garage since February. Not through a broker, not through any listing service. Through observation. Driving past, walking the perimeter, checking ownership records at the county assessor's office. Making a few quiet inquiries through people who knew people. 2 lots were owned by individuals. Both had been carrying the properties for years, tax bills arriving annually like reminders of a problem neither owner had solved. Cole contacted them directly. Letters, then phone calls, then a Tuesday afternoon meeting at a diner 2 blocks from the property. Both owners came. Both were reasonable. Both looked at Cole's offer and saw a fair price for land that had been doing nothing for a long time. They didn't know about the Phase 2 announcement. It wasn't public yet. Cole wasn't withholding anything that was legally required to be disclosed. The information had come through a private conversation, and the owners were being paid current assessed market value for their current land. Knowing something is not the same as being obligated to share it. That's not the same as taking advantage of someone. That's the difference between knowing something and knowing what to do with what you know. Total, $67,000 for both lots. Cole filed the deeds and placed a purchase option on a 3rd lot, convertible in 60 days, as a contingency against the Phase 2 announcement, making the math obvious to everyone at once. Frank Delano arrived Monday morning at 8:02, which told Cole something useful immediately. Not early enough to suggest anxiety, not late enough to suggest indifference. Right on the edge of on time, in the way of a man who measures punctuality against the work rather than against a clock. Frank was 51, broad through the shoulders, careful with his hands the way craftsmen are careful, not tentative, precise. He walked through the garage without being shown around, looking at everything, touching nothing. When he got to the Pantera, he stopped, stood in front of it for a full minute, then turned to Cole. "This is real," he said. "Yes, where did you find it?" "It was here when I bought the building." Frank looked around the garage, at the new roof, at the sealed floor, at the organized bays and the proper lighting, then back at the Pantera. "All right," he said. "Tell me where you want to start." The Barrett-Jackson consignment submission went in during the 2nd week of April. After Frank had assessed the Pantera in full, after the restoration plan had been written out in complete detail, after Cole had the documentation to support both the vehicle's provenance and a credible account of what the finished work would be. The event was the last Saturday of June, 10 weeks from submission, which was exactly the time they needed and not a day more. Cole filed the paperwork on a Wednesday afternoon, got the acceptance confirmation 2 weeks later. Lot number 8, evening session. He put the confirmation in the folder on his desk, poured a coffee, went back to the Pantera. The Pantera took everything they had. Not just time, not just money, everything, every skill in the building, every contact in Roy Sims's network. Every ounce of patience Danny Kowalski had accumulated in 20 years of working on things that didn't want to cooperate. The engine was the first problem and the biggest one, the V8. A Ford Cleveland unit mounted amidships in the Italian body, behind the passenger compartment. An arrangement that made the car feel like it was designed by someone who wanted every drive to be an event. Had been sitting immobile for the better part of 4 decades. Pistons seized in their bores. The crankshaft locked. Every moving surface fused by time and oxidation into something that was no longer an engine so much as a very expensive sculpture. Freeing it without destroying the block required patience of a specific and almost philosophical kind. Not force. Force would crack the block and ruin everything. Chemical process, day by day, the right penetrating compounds introduced carefully, in the right sequence, allowed to work at their own pace. Check in the morning, check in the afternoon, apply, wait, come back tomorrow. The process ran for 11 days before the first piston moved. When it moved, just slightly, just enough to confirm the bore was intact, Danny put down his tools, walked to the far wall, and stood there with his back to everyone for about 30 seconds. Then he walked back, picked up his tools. Okay, he said. That was all. The body components were Roy's problem, and Roy handled it the way he handled everything, methodically, through a network that Cole couldn't have built in 15 years, because it had taken Roy 15 years to build it himself. Calls went out to yards and collectors and estate representatives across the country. Some led nowhere, some led to leads. Some leads led to parts. A correct front valence, sourced through a contact in Nevada, who had 2 of them in a storage unit from a parts car he'd broken down in 1994, and never fully dispersed. Rear quarter trouned through a collector in Ohio, who had been holding it as a spare for a Pantera he'd sold 10 years ago, and hadn't gotten around to listing. Interior components that required 2 separate suppliers. One in Tennessee who stocked correct specification vinyl, one in Minnesota with the right carpet compound. None of it fast, none of it simple. Roy made the calls, followed the threads, confirmed the parts before committing to them. Because in the world of rare components, the wrong part that looked right was worse than no part at all. It sent you backward, and backward was a direction they couldn't afford. Frank handled the body with the concentrated focus of a man who understood that his work on this car would be the thing people looked at first and remembered longest. He worked the panels with his hands before he touched them with any tool, feeling for the low spots, mapping the high spots, understanding the metal's history before deciding how to address it. The rust he found was surface rust in 2 places and nothing worse, which was remarkable for a car that had spent 40 years in a building with a compromised roof and variable humidity. Remarkable and also explicable. Whoever had stored these cars had stored them with care. The tarps had done their job. The arrangement had been deliberate. Someone had loved these cars enough to protect them. Cole thought about that sometimes, working late. Who had put them here? What had happened that they'd been left? Whether the person who arranged those tarps had ever expected someone to find them or had simply hoped, in the way you hope for things you can't control, that whatever came next would treat them right. He thought he was treating them right. The paint process consumed Frank completely for the final 2 weeks. Strip to bare metal. Assess. Address every imperfection before primer went on, because primer locked in whatever was underneath it, and whatever was underneath came back eventually. 2 coats of primer, block between them. Color, a deep dark red, the factory specification, mixed from the original formula reference in 2 careful coats with full cure time between them. Then the clear, then the cut and polish. When Frank was done, when he rolled the car under the main work lights and stepped back and looked at what the surface had become, he stood there without speaking for a long time. Danny came to stand beside him. They looked at the car together. The red had done something unusual under the lights. Not the usual behavior of red paint, which tends to shout. This red absorbed. It pulled the light in rather than bouncing it back, and the effect was a depth that made the car look less like a painted surface and more like something solid and self-contained and entirely sure of itself. That's the finest thing I've ever worked on, Frank said. He said it quietly. Not to Cole, not to Danny. Just to the air. Cole looked at the car from across the bay, said, "Yeah," then went to his desk and opened the folder containing the Barrett Jackson paperwork. He'd submitted the Pantera for consignment consideration in March. Before the restoration was complete, on the strength of the vehicle's documented provenance and a detailed written restoration plan that laid out exactly what the car was, what had been done to it, and what the finished result would be. The submission had been accepted in April. Lot number 8, evening session, last Saturday of June, 10 weeks from submission to the event. Which meant they had exactly the time they needed and not a day more. Which was, Cole had come to understand about his own nature, exactly how he worked best. The Camaro and the Bel Air ran in parallel during the Pantera's final weeks. Not to completion, there wasn't time and there wasn't need. But far enough along to document, to assess, to know what they had and what it would take. Eleanor Prescott had already expressed interest in the Bel Air through a brief email. She had heard, through her collector network, that Cole had more than the Mustang. She didn't ask directly. She just mentioned that she'd heard things and that she remained interested in quality work. Cole replied that he would be in touch. He meant it. But the Pantera had to go first. The Pantera had to go first because it was the one that would establish what Hargrove Auto Works actually was. Not a lucky find. Not a man who stumbled into something and sold it for what he could get. A shop. A standard. A name that meant something when attached to a vehicle. The auction was the proof. 6 weeks away when Frank finished the paint. 5 weeks when the interior was complete. 4 weeks when Roy sourced the final trim piece. A correct driver's side door sill plate, found through a contact in upstate New York who had kept it in a box for 11 years without knowing quite what to do with it. 3 weeks when the electrical was done. Danny's description of the electrical process had evolved over the weeks from professional frustration to something approaching dark comedy. He started with, "The wiring is going to take a while," progressed to, "Whoever designed this system did not want it to be serviced." Arrived by the final week at a philosophical position best summarized as, "I have made peace with the fact that this car does not want to have working lights, and I am going to give it working lights anyway out of principle." The lights worked. Everything worked. When the car sat in the bay on a Wednesday afternoon 2 weeks before the auction, fully assembled, fully operational, fully finished, the 4 of them stood around it without saying much for a while. Cole, Danny, Frank, Roy. 4 people who had spent 6 weeks putting something back together that had spent 40 years coming apart. The car looked like it had just left the factory. Not a replica of that. Not an approximation. The thing itself recovered. Meredith Lane called on a Monday morning in the first week of June. Cole didn't recognize the number. He picked up anyway. He always picked up unknown numbers, because you never knew which call mattered. Cole Hargrove? Yes. Meredith Lane, Northeast Business Review. 9 years covering business and finance in this region. Okay. I've heard about what you're building on Kellner Street. I'd like to talk to you about it. I'm not interested in being profiled. I know. That's why I'm calling instead of just showing up. Cole said nothing. Meredith continued, "I'm not interested in writing about success. Success is boring to read about. I'm interested in the moment someone sees something everyone else has already dismissed and decides to act on what they saw. That's the story I want to write." Cole looked across the garage at the Pantera, still under its protective cover. Finished, underneath it. 30 minutes, he said. She arrived Wednesday morning with a notebook and a pen, not a recorder. A notebook. Cole noticed, said nothing about it, filed it the same way he filed everything, without comment but not without meaning. She walked through the garage first, unhurried, looking at the bays, at the Bel Air on the lift, at the Camaro in its station, the Pantera in the corner with its cover on. She stopped in front of it for a long time. Then, "Tell me about the morning you opened the tarps." "So," Cole told her, the 6:00 a.m. arrival. The flashlight. The 8 tarps in 30 minutes. Each car, the notebook, the milk crate. The number he wrote down 3 times before he was satisfied he'd gotten it right. Meredith wrote everything down, didn't interrupt, didn't prompt, just listened and wrote. When he finished with the tarps, she said, "The building. Who sold it to you?" "Whitfield Capital Group," Cole said. CEO signed the paperwork personally. Meredith wrote it down. Underlined it. Twice Cole watched her do it and said nothing. They talked for 2.5 hours, not 30 minutes. She had done her research before calling, had spoken to someone at the impound yard, which Cole registered without showing it. She asked about the crankshaft from Ohio, About the night the roof came down. About the towing work at 2:47 in the morning. She asked about the notebook. Cole told her about Ray. About the Saturdays. About the line in the middle of the notebook that he'd read so many times in his life and heard differently each time, depending on what he was going through. She wrote it all down. Near the end, she asked one more question. When you were sitting on the milk crate, in the dark, after you found the Pantera, what did you actually think? Cole looked at the eastern wall, the concrete block section Frank hadn't touched, still stained, still original, still exactly what it was the morning of the tarps. Don't be wrong about this, he said. Meredith wrote it down. Didn't underline it. Some things don't need underlining. The article ran on a Tuesday morning. 4 days before the auction. Cole read it at his desk before the crew arrived, coffee going cold beside him the way it always did when he was reading something carefully. It was accurate. Every number correct, every sequence right. She had written about the tarps and the milk crate and the roof and the towing and the $1,000 and the key on the folding table in the wind. And about Ray Hargrove and the notebook. And at the end, his own about this. Cole set the paper down, drank his cold coffee, went back to work. Sandra Whitfield read the article at her desk at 8:14 that same morning. Her attorney had placed it there before she arrived, hadn't said anything, just left it on top of everything else, which was its own message. She read it straight through. When she finished, she set it down with a deliberateness that was different from just putting something down. The deliberateness of someone who has read something accurate about themselves and needs a moment before responding to it. Her attorney stepped back into the room. We should discuss how to respond publicly. Sandra looked at the window for a moment. Get me a ticket for Saturday night. The Barrett-Jackson event? Yes. And the response to the article? I'll handle that separately. Her attorney left. Sandra sat alone for a while. She was not a woman who spent much time alone with unresolved things. Her professional life had been built around resolution, identify the situation, assess it, act, move on. The gap between assessing and acting was where she was most efficient. This was different. Because the article didn't describe a situation she could act on. It described a mistake. Her mistake. Documented, numerical, traceable from beginning to end by anyone who read the piece carefully. She had walked into a building full of covered cars and walked out again and called it empty. She had sold it for $1,000. She sat with that. Then she straightened the papers on her desk and went back to work. But she kept the ticket. Cole put on the dark suit at 5:30. It still fit. Of course it did. He was the same person he'd been the last time he wore it. His father's funeral 5 years ago. Same weight, same shoulders. The same person, just carrying different things now than he'd been carrying then. He stood in front of the mirror for a moment. Straightened the jacket. Left. The conference facility was not the kind of place Cole usually spent time in. High ceilings. Good lighting. The engineered kind, warm and directional, designed to make everything in the room look more valuable than it might look somewhere else. The specific sound of 200 people who knew what things were worth and had the resources to act on that knowledge, talking to each other in the register. People use when they're comfortable with the stakes. Cole arrived when he meant to arrive. Exactly, Danny was already there. Second row, ale seat, arms crossed over his chest in the posture of a man who is attempting to appear relaxed and has miscalculated. His jaw was set in the particular way it's set when he was working hard not to reveal something. Cole sat beside him. Neither said anything. This was normal. Eleanor Prescott came in at 6:45 with 2 people from her collector network. A man and a woman, both in their 60s, both with the unhurried movement of people who had attended many events like this one. Eleanor moved through the room without effort, without performance, the way someone moves when they belong in a space. She spotted Cole from across the hall, raised her chin. A small acknowledgement. Private. Cole nodded once. The evening session opened with 7 lots before the Pantera. Cole sat through all 7, not watching the auction, watching the room, where the serious bidders were positioned, who was at the phones. How the money moved when a number hit a threshold. He'd attended enough auctions over his year's advantage to read a room this way, to understand the currents beneath the surface of what appeared to be a simple transaction between a buyer and a seller. Danny watched the auction. That 65 Shelby went to $340, he said quietly after lot 5. Good room, Cole said. Good room, Danny confirmed. They sat with that. Lot number 8. The lights in the room shifted when the Pantera came through the curtain onto the main floor. Not a dramatic shift. The overhead rig tracked the car the way it was designed to track featured vehicles. And the effect was that the dark red paint caught the light differently than anything else that had come out that evening. Caught it and held it, drew it in. The room responded. Not with applause, not yet. With something quieter and more genuine. A collective shift in posture and attention, the sound of 200 people having the same involuntary reaction at the same moment and none of them announcing it. Danny uncrossed his arms. The auctioneer introduced the vehicle, history, rarity. Production numbers, total units across all model years, roughly 10,000, a figure that landed in the room with appropriate weight. Then restoration provenance, Hargrove Auto Works, Kellner Street. The restoring team, Cole Hargrove. A section of the audience applauded, warmer than protocol. Warmer than the standard lot acknowledgement required. Because 4 days was enough time for a well-written story in a regional publication to circulate through a community of people who understood exactly what paying $1,000 for something like this meant. Who understood the tarps. Who understood the milk crate and the roof and the towing work at 2:47 in the morning. They weren't applauding a transaction. They were applauding a way of seeing. Danny looked at Cole. Cole looked at the floor. The bidding opened at $80,000. Fast to $100,000. $130,000 with 3 active bidders. 2 on the floor, 1 on the phone. $155,000 and a pause. The room adjusted. That specific recalibration that happens when a number crosses a line that everyone in the room knows means something. Phone bidder. $168,000. The man in the third row, older blue jacket, the stillness of someone who had done this many times, came back. $72,000. Phone bidder, $175,000. Blue jacket, $178,000. Silence. The auctioneer let it breathe 5 seconds. 10, 15. The phone bidder did not respond. The hammer came down $178,000. Danny exhaled so loudly that the woman in the seat beside him turned and looked directly at him. He didn't notice. Or he noticed and had decided it didn't matter. Cole sat still for a moment. The length of time it takes to confirm internally that what just happened is what actually happened and you've read the number correctly, and the hammer has genuinely fallen and this is real. Then he stood up. Accepted the handshake from the floor representative, firm, complete, actual. Eleanor Prescott, 3 rows back, watched him do it. She pressed her lips together in something that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite not a smile. The expression of someone who bet correctly on a judgment call and isn't surprised but is satisfied. Danny was still sitting, still looking at the empty floor where the Pantera had stood. Cole said his name. Danny looked up. Cole looked at him. That was the whole exchange, no words. But Danny understood everything inside it. The cot by the south wall, the roof in February, the $200 and the towing and the Ohio crankshaft, and 11 days of chemical process and 6 weeks of work that had brought them from a milk crate in the dark to this room, this number, this moment. Danny nodded. They moved toward the hallway. Sandra Whitfield had been standing near the rear of the hall for the duration of the Pantera's lot. Cole had known she was there. He'd seen her when he came in, positioned back from the main seating, where she could see without being in the middle of things. He registered her the way he registered everything, noted it, filed it, returned his attention to what was in front of him. After the session concluded and the room began to thin, he was talking to a representative from the auction house when he saw her move. She was walking toward him. No Patrick Sorensen, no attorney, no engineer. Nothing between her and the open floor of the hall. Just Sandra. Different coat than February. Navy structured, same quality, different occasion. Different evening entirely. Meredith Lane saw her moving. Notebook already open. 9 years of practice at positioning herself correctly before things happened. Sandra stopped in front of Cole. Looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then I misjudged the situation. No elaboration, no additional language to soften it or reframe it or spread its weight across a longer statement. Just the acknowledgement. Direct and complete. Cole looked at her. He was aware of the room. How many people were still present? Meredith's notebook at the edge of his peripheral vision. The empty floor behind Sandra where the Pantera had stood 20 minutes ago. He thought about the folding table in the February wind. The sound of quiet laughter that had followed him to his car. He thought about the cot by the south wall. He let it go. You saw what the building looked like, he said. You made a call based on what was visible. I made a different call based on what I believed was underneath. We looked at the same thing with different equipment. Something settled in Sandra's face. Not the collapse of someone who has been defeated. The settling of someone who has heard something accurate and recognized it. Cole extended his hand. She took it, not quickly. Not as a formality. Then Cole turned and walked back to where Danny was standing at the hallway entrance, said something to him quietly, and they both looked for a moment at the empty floor where the Pantera had been. And then they started talking about the Camaro, because there was still more to do. There was always more to do. That conversation, quiet, two men talking about the next job while the room around them was still processing the last one, was its kind of answer to everything that had happened in the previous 5 months. No ceremony, no pause to take stock, just what comes next and how do we begin. The financial picture came into focus over the days that followed. Total revenue from vehicle sales, $398,000. Not projected, cleared, real. The 3 lots, purchased in April and early May for a combined $67,000, had been independently assessed after the city's formal Phase 2 announcement in late May. The announcement came on a Thursday. The assessments were done by Monday. Combined current value, $520,000. Nearly 3 times what he'd paid in 6 weeks. Active restoration contracts, $145,000 in confirmed work. A commission from Eleanor Prescott for a vehicle she'd sourced independently and wanted Hargrove's team to restore. 2 additional contracts from clients in her network who had read Meredith's article and called the number at the bottom of the piece. The phone had been ringing. Cole answered when he could, called back in the evenings. The conversations were short. He asked questions, gathered information, told people he would be in touch, and was. The Camaro and the Galaxy were still in process, still building toward what they would become. Their value was real, but not yet realized. Still coming, total net asset value, accounting for equipment and property and outstanding contracts and the 2 vehicles still in the bays, north of $1 million. The exact figure moved depending on the day you calculated it. Cole was not particularly interested in the exact figure. He was interested in the next job on the list. Danny's equity conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon. 20%, Cole said at the workbench, between tasks. Okay, you should take some time with it. I have, in about 4 seconds. I work fast. Cole looked at him. Danny looked back. Okay, Cole said, 4 minutes beginning to end. The building permit application went in on a Friday morning. Multi-bay facility. Dedicated paint booth. Climate-controlled storage bay. Office wing all on the consolidated lot. The original garage footprint plus the 2 purchased lots plus the option lot. Now converted. 900 square feet becoming something considerably larger. Project name on the application, Hargrove Auto Works Building 1. Cole submitted it. Poured a coffee. Went back to work. On a Thursday evening in early July, after the crew had gone home and Danny's compressor was still running in the back bay. He'd left it cycling, as he sometimes did. The sound of a shop still breathing after the people had gone. Cole walked back into the garage. Not to work, just to stand in it. The roof had been replaced in April. New membrane, new ridge cap, no more sag at the eastern corner. The concrete floor cleaned and sealed. The roll-up door on its new motor, smooth and quiet. The electrical, new panel, new circuits throughout, every light positioned exactly where the work required it. The space was organized, purposeful. Every surface and every tool in a place that made sense. Cole walked to the eastern corner. The wall there was the same wall it had always been. Concrete block spotted with rust stains from the old roof, darkened with 60 years of accumulated time. Frank had refinished every other surface in the building. Cole had told him, leave this section exactly as it is. Frank had looked at the wall. The whole section? Yes, it's the only part of the building that still looks the way it did when you bought it. I know. Frank had moved on without another word. He was a craftsman. He understood that sometimes the most important thing is knowing what not to touch. Cole put his hand flat against the block, the way he had in February. In the dark flashlight in his other hand, 8 tarps still in front of him, no certainty yet about what was underneath. He stood there, not thinking in sentences, not reviewing the numbers or the permits or the contracts, just standing in the room where it had started. in the corner where he'd first understood that this building was something different from what it looked like. Ray Hargrove had worked one bay for 22 years. Had built one thing and kept it running and handed his son, every Saturday for years, a way of moving through the world that couldn't be filed or taxed or restructured away at 11:17 on a Friday night. He never saw the Pantera, never heard the hammer come down, never stood in this garage with its proper lighting and its sealed floor and the permits for building one on the desk. Never saw any of it, but all of it had come from him. Cole took his hand off the wall, stood still for a moment, then walked to the small desk in the corner, the office he'd made for himself, second-hand desk, a chair that was actually comfortable, a window that looked out over the lot where Building 1 would go up in the fall. He sat down, took the notebook from the inner pocket of his jacket, opened it to the page with his father's line. And his own line below it, written in February, with the roof failing and $2,200 in the account and everything still uncertain. He read both. Then he took out his pen and wrote below them. She saw the price of things and called it understanding. I tried to see what things were made of and let the price follow from that. Neither of us was wrong exactly. We were just looking for different things. And in one transaction on one cold morning, the distance between those two ways of looking was worth $1,000 on one side and everything else on the other. Dad was right. He was right about all of it. Cole read it back, then he capped the pen, closed the notebook. Held it for a moment. The weight of it, the 30 years, and the 5 years and the 8 months all living together on the same page, in the same pocket, carried by the same person from the same day. He put it back in his jacket, turned off the desk lamp, stood up. Through the wall, the compressor Danny had left running continued its slow, steady pulse. The sound of a shop that was working, that was alive. That had been built from one decision, one key, one number written in a notebook, and a way of looking at things that most people had already walked past without stopping. Cole turned off the bay lights. The garage went dark. He walked to the side door, opened it, stepped out into the July evening. Warm now, the same street entirely transformed from February, remade by season into something that barely resembled the morning he'd sat in his car in 19-degree cold and looked at a broken building and made a decision. He locked the door, walked to his truck, drove home. The garage on Kellner Street had been sold for $1,000 by a woman who was certain she understood value. Cole Hargrove had paid $1,000 for it because he understood something else entirely, and the thing he understood was not the cars, not the land, not the auction or the article or the handshake or the number in the account. It was simpler than all of that. The difference between what something looks like and what it is. That difference, measured in months of work and a February roof and a father's handwriting carried in a jacket pocket, turned out to be worth considerably more than $1,000. It turned out to be worth everything.